My husband saw my name saved as office wife on a coworker's phone. He left everyone shocked. It's strange, really, how something as small as a name in someone's phone could blow up an entire life, an entire marriage. I used to think the whole office spouse thing was just harmless fun, a running joke between coworkers, but I guess now I know better. Things had been rocky for a few weeks before everything started to fall apart between us. My husband Simon had always been the jealous type, even before we got married. Back when we were still dating, it wasn't unusual for him to get tense if another man so much as glanced in my direction. One time, he even got into a shouting match at a party because he thought someone was flirting with me. It embarrassed me at the time, but I brushed it off as him being in the heat of the moment and as proof that he cared. I told myself it came from love and that he just didn't want to lose me. And I was right, because over the years, that side of him quieted down. He grew calmer and more secure. Maybe it was marriage, or maybe he finally trusted that I wasn't going anywhere. Either way, we found a rhythm that worked. When Simon wasn't letting his jealousy or ego get the best of him, things between us were genuinely good. Our marriage was great even. It was all the things I'd hoped it'd be, and for years that was enough. But then, a few months ago, something changed, and old habits started to resurface. It began around the same time things at work picked up for me. I was a lawyer at the time, and my firm had just landed a high-profile case, one that everyone wanted to be a part of. When I was assigned to it, it felt like a huge step forward in my career. It also meant longer hours, more pressure, and a lot less time at home. At first, Simon was supportive, and I remember thinking how lucky I was to have someone so patient and understanding. But as the weeks passed, that patience thinned. The later I got home, the quieter he became, and then questions started creeping in. They were casual at first, almost harmless. He'd ask things like, "Who's staying late with you? How long do you think this will take?" I told myself he was just being curious and that he missed me. But then more time passed, and things stopped being casual. His tone made it clear he wasn't asking because he wanted to know about my day. He would ask questions like he knew something I didn't, like he was trying to confirm suspicions I wasn't even aware of. I could see it in the way he'd pause after my answers, studying me like he was searching for cracks or slip-ups. Still, I didn't take it too seriously. I thought once the case was over, things would go back to normal. I told him as much, and he would nod, maybe even smile. But there was still this weird air of doubt he had when he looked at me. By the second month, I was barely home before midnight, and my days bled into nights. Even when I was home, I wasn't really present. My phone never stopped buzzing, and I was always on my laptop. I could tell it grated on him, and it became obvious that it did when he started making small comments under his breath. These little jabs that stung more than I wanted to admit. He would say things like, "You spend more time with your firm than with your husband." Or, "Maybe I should start charging by the hour for your attention." I'd roll my eyes and tell him not to be dramatic, but each time his words got sharper. There was a bitterness to them that hadn't been there before, and it made me realize how much resentment had been simmering beneath the surface. Looking back now, I can't say exactly when things tipped from uneasy to unstable. I was too focused on my work, and he was too consumed by his suspicions. Neither of us realized how far apart we'd grown until it was too late to bridge the distance. And Simon's jealousy only grew. It crept into every corner of our lives until even silence felt suspicious. It wasn't just the small comments anymore. He began to interrogate me like I was a witness on trial. "Who was on the call this late? Why did it take you so long to get home? Are you sure you were at the office?" At first, I'd try to answer calmly and explain my schedule. I'd even show him emails or messages if he pressed too much, but no matter what I said, his expression never changed. He'd just look at me like he didn't believe a word, like everything out of my mouth was part of some elaborate lie. Some nights I fought back. I'd snap at him for not trusting me and for turning every conversation into an interrogation. But those arguments always spiraled. Small, stupid things would turn into shouting matches. We'd go in circles until both of us were exhausted, and then we'd stop talking altogether. Eventually, I just stopped trying. I was too tired and stretched thin between the pressure at work and the constant tension at home. Fighting with him didn't fix anything. It only made me dread coming back home. So I started doing what I could to avoid it altogether. I'd get home, take off my shoes by the door, and head straight upstairs before he could start. When I finished with my work, I'd shower, crawl into bed, and pretend to be asleep before he joined me. I told myself it was temporary, that once the case was over, once the late nights ended, things would go back to normal. He'd see that there was nothing to worry about and we'd find our rhythm again. I believed that so fiercely it almost felt inevitable. But I was wrong. The more distance I put between us, the more suspicious he became. He started doing weird things like asking for my schedule all the time or calling in the middle of the day just to check in. I could feel him spiraling and part of me wanted to reach out and reassure him, but every attempt just seemed to make it worse. Still, one night I decided to try again. It was a Thursday. I left work earlier than usual and picked up some food from our favorite place on the way home. I hadn't done that in months, so I'd thought I'd make the effort. I wanted to fix things, even just a little. When I got home, he was in the living room, scrolling through his phone. He smiled when he saw me, which I took as a good sign. He commented on how early I was, and I told him I'd left early so we could have dinner together since we hadn't in a long time. He looked surprised, but didn't argue. He got plates from the kitchen while I unpacked the food, and for a little while it felt like we were us again. We were talking and laughing. We ate while I told him what I could about the case, and about how exhausting it was, but also how much I was learning. After dinner, we curled up on the couch to watch a movie. I could barely pay attention to the screen, though. I was too caught up in how much I'd missed us spending time together. I remember thinking maybe that was the start of things getting better. Maybe we just needed more moments like this. But life has a cruel sense of timing, and our peace didn't last forever. About halfway through the movie, there was a knock on the door. We wondered who it could be, and agreed that it must be a neighbor come to borrow something. He got up and went to the door while I stayed on the couch. I only started paying attention when I heard his voice change. His tone was sharp and almost angry when he asked, "You're from her office?" I turned my head, but I couldn't see clearly. I was confused, so I got up to see what was going on, and standing at the door was Eric. He was one of my coworkers, someone I'd been working closely with on the case. He looked more than a little awkward standing there holding my navy blazer. He greeted me and smiled when he saw me. Then he explained that I had left my blazer in the office and he'd decided to drop it off on his way home. It was only until he said it that I realized he was right. I hadn't come home with my blazer that night, so I thanked him and reached for it. I didn't think it was anything serious, but then I noticed that Simon hadn't said a word since I got to the door. I turned to him and saw that he was still standing there, his hand gripping the door frame like he needed to hold himself back. His eyes moved between us, studying every little gesture and word. I told Eric good night and to drive safe, and then you shut the door. Once I heard his car pull out of the driveway, I turned to Simon again and saw that he was still standing in the same spot, but he was glaring at me. I sighed and set the jacket on the side table before asking, "What? Who is he?" he asked. And I told him that Eric was a coworker, one I had even told him about before during one of his jealous episodes. Then he started asking why Eric knew where I lived and why I left my jacket with him. I tried to remain calm as I told him that Eric had dropped me off at home once or twice, and that I hadn't left my jacket with him. I had just forgotten it at the office. Simon's eyes narrowed. "So he gives you rides home now?" "Oh, for God's sake," I argued. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" His voice kept getting higher, and I could tell he was getting more upset. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your coworker is a little too comfortable showing up at our house at night." Again, I tried to get him to calm down, and I told him that Eric was just being nice by returning my jacket, and that it really didn't mean anything. I told him that he was blowing the whole thing out of proportion, but Simon wasn't listening. "Don't do that," he told me. "Don't act like I'm crazy for noticing how strange this is. You've been coming home late for months. You've barely spoken to me, and you've been glued to your laptop all the time. Now this guy shows up at our house and I'm supposed to just believe it's all innocent?" "Yes, Simon, you are. Because it is innocent," was what I told him, but he was just convinced that I was hiding something from him, that I had concocted some big lie and I was trying to gaslight him or something. We went back and forth for a while. He accused me of hiding something, and I kept telling him over and over again that I wasn't, and that Eric was just a coworker. But he couldn't be reasoned with, and eventually, He said what he had been wanting to say since Eric showed up. He asked if Eric was the reason I'd been staying out late, if there was even a case at all, and if I'd been sleeping with him. For a second, I didn't move. I just stared at him because I didn't know what to say. My mind was blank and my heart had sunk to my stomach. I couldn't believe he had said something like that. Simon had been jealous before, too many times in fact, but he had never gone this far, never crossed that line, and hearing it, that accusation, something inside me just cracked. I asked if he actually thought that I would do something like that, but he didn't answer. He just looked at me, his expression a mix of hurt and anger. Unbelievable, I said, shaking my head. All this over a stupid fucking jacket, was what I told him, and it was all it took to really set him off. He started going on about how distant and secretive I'd been, and how he wasn't blind to what was really going on, so I yelled back and told him that I'd been working my ass off for months, and that I didn't need to deal with his fragile ego along with all the work I had to do. In the end, we were both yelling and saying things we didn't mean but couldn't stop. The words came too fast and without thought. I called him paranoid and obsessive, and he told me that I wasn't loyal and that he wasn't sure he trusted me anymore. Something about that really pissed me off. After years of marriage and me coddling him through every one of his jealous tirades, he still didn't trust me. The sadness I was feeling turned to anger in an instant, and something inside me just snapped. I grabbed the jacket off the table and threw it at him. It hit his chest before it fell to the floor. "Fine," I said. My voice was already breaking at that point. "If that's what you really think of me, then there's nothing left to say." He didn't answer. Honestly, he didn't even need to. I turned away before he could see the tears in my eyes and went upstairs. I closed the bedroom door behind me and then I just stood there. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet between us didn't feel temporary. Simon had taken things too far, but I had kept things too. Because in all honesty, things between Eric and me weren't exactly innocent at the time. Not in the way Simon imagined, but not entirely clean either. I never outright lied to Simon, I just didn't tell him everything. Eric and I were already friends before the case started, but being the only two junior associates assigned to it meant we were practically glued to each other for months. We were together during late nights, weekend meetings, and early morning court preps. It was always the two of us side by side. And somewhere along the way, that kind of routine created a strange intimacy. Not romantic, or at least that's what I told myself, but definitely more than casual. I'd practically moved into his office by the time of the jacket incident. My laptop, my files, even my favorite coffee mug, all of it had migrated there. It just made sense logistically. His office was bigger than mine and slightly closed off. It was quieter and we just got more done that way. We spent so much time together that our coworkers started jokingly calling him my work husband. We laughed it off every time, but there was always this unspoken awareness between us, something neither of us really acknowledged. That was probably how he'd noticed my jacket in the first place. He always stayed later than I did, and since I left in such a hurry that night, it must have been sitting somewhere in his office. Of course he'd bring it back. That was Eric. He was just thoughtful like that. And that was why, when I came into work the morning after the fight, the first thing that happened was Eric showing up at my door, looking worried. He asked if everything was okay because things seemed tense between me and Simon the previous night. I did what I could to tell him I was fine, but it was obvious he didn't believe me. He didn't push, though. Instead, he just offered to take me to lunch. It wasn't the first time we'd gone out for lunch together. Sometimes we'd grab sandwiches from the place across the street and eat in the park. But that morning, after the fight with Simon, it felt like a risk. Still, there was something about Eric's insistence that made it hard to say no. I tried to tell that it wasn't the best idea, but he shut me down and told me it would be good for me, and I'd beat better after. It was hard to argue with that. So against my better judgment, I agreed. By noon, we were sitting across from each other in a small restaurant a few blocks from the office. I picked up my salad while Eric told a story about one of our senior partners accidentally sending a weird meme to the entire firm before I started working there. I laughed in spite of myself. I mentioned very vaguely that things had been tense at home. He didn't ask for details. He just nodded and said that it sounded difficult and that he was sorry. Then he shifted the conversation toward office gossip and some important information about the case our boss had told him that morning. By the end of lunch, I felt lighter. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't tense or on edge. Eric made it so much easier to just be me and not be worried all the time. When we got back to the office, we slipped right back into work mode, but there was more ease to it. The tension from that morning had faded completely, and I found myself smiling at how easy it was for Eric to make me feel comfortable. A few days later, after more stress and long nights, our team finally caught a break in the case in the form of more evidence. So everyone started talking about getting drinks to celebrate that night. I hesitated when I saw the messages. Things with Simon were still bad. If anything, they were even worse. We'd barely spoken since the fight. At home, we hovered around each other like ghosts. He still looked at me like I was hiding something, and I could almost feel the words he didn't say on the tip of my own tongue. Sometimes I'd catch him staring when I came home late. He wouldn't ask questions anymore, but the silence was just as accusing. I'd stopped trying to defend myself. Honestly, I'd stopped trying, period. So after a bit of hesitation over those messages, I decided not to tell him. It wasn't even about lying. It was about avoiding another needless, senseless argument I didn't have the energy for. I told myself it was harmless. It was just one night out with coworkers. That evening, we all met at a bar near the office. The place was nothing fancy, and it was already full of people still in their work clothes trying to forget about work. So we blended right in. Eric and I ended up sitting together, as usual. We'd always gravitated toward each other naturally, the way people do when they've shared too much time together. He ordered whiskey while I stuck to wine, and we made jokes about how stereotypical we were. We mostly spent the night talking about everything from the case to our coworkers, and even the random playlist the bar was playing. We occasionally joined in the larger conversation, just so it wouldn't seem like we were excluding ourselves. Then his favorite song came on, something cheesy from the 80s that I can't remember now. I just remember how it made his whole face light up. He got up and held out his hand, but I just rolled my eyes. He said that I had to dance with him. I tried to tell him no, but he just looked so happy that I couldn't bring myself to do it. I was already tipsy, and honestly, it had been so long since I'd felt light like that, or felt anything other than tired. So I gave in, and I agreed. Our coworkers cheered as he led me to the small dance floor. At first, it was all jokes and laughter. We spun around and danced off beat. I'm sure we must have looked ridiculous pretending to perform for our small audience. For those few minutes, I forgot about Simon, about the fight, about everything waiting for me at home. I just danced and enjoyed being free. Then, as the song faded, the next one started. It was a slow one. The others lost interest after that and turned back to their drinks and gossip, leaving us alone. We slowed down too. It was instinctual the way our moves softened. His hand rested on my waist and mine on his shoulder. We were too close and I knew it. I knew I should have stepped back, but I didn't. For the first time in weeks, maybe even months, it felt nice to be held. I didn't admit to myself then, but I know now that it felt so nice because it was Eric holding me. Eric laughed quietly to himself, breaking the silence. I asked him what was so funny, and he said something about how he never thought he'd actually get to do this with me. I was confused, and I laughed before I asked him, "Do what, dance with me?" He hesitated, and I watched as his gaze dropped to my lips very briefly before he looked at me again. "Not the dancing," he said softly. "Just this, being close to you." Something fluttered in my chest. It wasn't an unfamiliar feeling, but I knew it was a dangerous one. I pulled back slightly, enough to look at him properly, and that was when I noticed just how close our faces were. The space between us felt so thin and fragile in that moment. We stayed like that for a moment, neither of us moving or saying anything. I was so caught up in him, I didn't think about anything else. All I did was let myself imagine what it would be like if I didn't pull away. Then one of our coworkers shouted something from the booth about leaving room for Jesus, and that broke whatever spell I was under pretty quickly. I stepped back so fast I almost tripped. Then I mumbled something about needing air. Eric called after me, but I was already moving. I grabbed my bag and practically ran outside. I ordered a ride, and luckily it didn't waste too much time. As the car drove through the streets, I stared out the window and tried to make sense of what had happened and all the emotions I was feeling. The truth was, I hadn't run because I didn't want him to kiss me. I ran because I did. And that terrified me more than anything. In the days that followed the night at the bar, I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, that whatever happened between Eric and me, whatever almost happened anyway, was a one-off moment that didn't mean anything. But of course, things had changed. I could feel it in the way my chest felt tight every time I saw him, and in the way my stomach flipped when he looked at me. I didn't know if he noticed it too, but I hoped he didn't. Pretending was easier. Pretending meant I could still go home and look Simon in the eye. And Simon, for his part, started trying again, in his own way. He was never the kind of man to apologize outright, not even when he knew he was wrong. Words had never been his strength. He was more of an action and acts of service kind of guy. His way of saying sorry wasn't through conversations, but through small, practical gestures, doing things that he knew mattered to me. The first morning it happened, I came downstairs still exhausted from another late night, only to find breakfast already waiting on the table. There was also some lunch packed for me in the small bag I usually carried to work. He didn't say anything about it. He just gave me a look that was, for the first time in a while, not mostly a glare. That was all, no apology or anything. But I understood what he was trying to do. And while part of me appreciated it and wanted to lean into his effort, another part couldn't. Because every time I thought of him waiting up for me, waking up early to make me food, trying to fix things between us, all I could think about was Eric. The guilt was awful. At work, things between Eric and me were careful. For the first few days after the bar, neither of us mentioned what had happened. We avoided eye contact when we could and kept our conversations short and professional. But eventually the awkwardness began to fade and we were back to ourselves again. It was almost like nothing had happened. Almost. Because sometimes, in those quiet moments when everyone else had gone home and it was just the two of us in the office, I could still feel something hovering in the air between us. Then one night, it stopped being unspoken. It was late, probably past 10, and the office was mostly empty. We'd been working for hours and were both exhausted. He was in his chair, laptop on his desk, while I sat on his couch going over some final notes, but I couldn't focus. Every time he shifted or made a comment about something on his screen, my attention wavered. My mind kept replaying that night at the bar. I kept thinking about his hand on my waist and the way he looked at me when he'd said what he'd said. Eventually, I set my pen down and called his name. When he responded, I just went right for it. I wasn't sure why I was asking, I just knew that I needed to do it. So I asked him if he meant what he said that night at the bar, if he meant it when he said he never thought he'd be close to me like that. He froze for a second before he responded. You really want me to answer that? After I said yes, he set his laptop aside and leaned back with an exhale. You're not going to like the answer. Was what he said, but I told him to tell me anyway. He stood, crossed the room, and sat down beside me on the couch. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then finally, he spoke. I've had feelings for you for months, he confessed. I tried not to, I really did. You're married and I respect that. But the more time we spent together, the harder it got to ignore it. I didn't know what to say. I just stared at him as my heart pounded in my chest so hard it almost hurt. So I told him that I didn't know what to say and that it was all so confusing. He reached out, and his movements were almost shy as he brushed a strand of hair behind my ear. We're both confused, he said softly. And before I could think, before I could decide what was right or wrong, he leaned in and kissed me. It was slow and careful. I should have pulled away. I knew I should have. I couldn't do it, though. Instead, I kissed him back. For a long moment, everything else, the office, the guilt, even Simon, just disappeared. It was just the two of us, caught in something that felt too real and too dangerous to name. When we finally broke apart, neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The air between us said enough. It was like we both made a decision in that moment, and before I knew it, clothes were flying off, and our hands were all over each other. We did a lot of things that night, but we never had sex. We stopped before crossing that final line. Somehow, even through all the blurred boundaries, that was one I couldn't bring myself to break. When I finally left the office, the guilt hit me before I even got home. By the time I walked through the door and saw Simon asleep on the couch, still in his work clothes, I felt sick with it. But even as the guilt tore through me, there was another truth I couldn't ignore. And that was that Eric made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. So it didn't stop. We never talked about that night, never defined what it was. It just kind of took on a life of its own. Late nights in his office, the two of us working side by side until everyone else was gone. And then slowly, we would just stop working, and then we would move closer, and eventually, we'd just find ourselves caught up in each other again. We never crossed the final line. No sex, nothing that couldn't technically be taken back. But we both knew what it was. And somehow, that made it worse. Weeks passed like that. At home, Simon and I slowly started to get closer again. He kept doing the small things like making breakfast, asking about my day, or helping around the house. He didn't bring up the fight again, and I didn't bring up my late nights. We existed in this fragile balance and pretending that peace was the same as forgiveness. At work, the case finally came to an end. We'd won, which meant a very lucrative victory for the firm. So the partners decided to throw a small celebration at the office to mark the win. I mentioned it to Simon one evening, almost without thinking. He was helping me dry the dishes when I told him about it. He just nodded and gave a small smile. And then before I could stop myself, I said he should come. It slipped out so naturally I almost didn't realize what I'd said until he stopped what he was doing, clearly shocked. He asked if that was what I really wanted, and I wasn't sure how to answer because I didn't want him there, but a small part of me also kind of did. So, in the end, I just forced a smile and said yes. But later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the dread and the panic started to settle. Because if Simon came, he'd see Eric. And if he saw Eric, if he so much as noticed the way we looked at each other, I just knew it would all fall apart. The night before the party, I tried to call Eric to tell him to keep his distance, that it would be better if we barely interacted while Simon was there. But he didn't pick up, so I left him a text explaining that we needed to keep our distance, and eventually he just responded with an okay. Which wasn't great, but it helped to calm my nerves a lot. Then the night of the party came and the whole thing was in full swing. The atmosphere was fun and celebratory, and everyone was in a good mood. Simon fit in better than I expected. He shook hands, made small talk, and even laughed at a few jokes. For a while, I let myself believe that maybe everything would be fine, but I couldn't relax. Not fully. My eyes kept scanning the room, searching for Eric. I wanted us to talk and just clear the air a bit, but he was nowhere to be seen. For the first hour, there was no sign of him. I started to think maybe he'd decided not to come, maybe he'd understood without me saying it. But then, hours later, I finally saw him. When I turned, my heart nearly stopped, because Simon was standing near the bar, drink in hand, talking to Eric. And what shocked me even more was that they both seemed calm, normal even. I froze where I stood, watching from across the room. They looked almost friendly with the way they muttered to each other, and I couldn't help the panic that overtook me. What were they saying? What did Eric tell him? I couldn't help all the questions in my head. The crowd was too thick to reach them in time. But from across the room, I could see that Simon was now frowning, and Eric looked a little uneasy. It felt like moving through honey with the way everyone was walking so slow, and spent my time pushing through the crowd, calling Eric's phone a few times to see if I could get his attention. By the time I finally made it across the room, Eric was gone. So I just walked up to Simon and tried to play it cool. I asked him if he'd seen Eric or knew where he went, because our boss was looking for him. Simon lied to me and said no. I didn't have the energy to even think about why. I just continued on and explained that I'd been calling, but I'd gotten no response. It wasn't until I said that Simon's expression shifted. He eyed me, his usual, all-too-familiar suspicion, and then asked me to call him again. I should have noticed that something was up, and that he was acting strange, but I was just so caught up in worrying about Eric. I didn't even think before doing as he asked and calling Eric. And the second I pushed that button, the phone in Simon's hand started ringing. That was when Simon fully glared at me and, without saying a word, held up the screen for me to see. Across the screen, clear as day, were the words, "Office Wife." For a second, I didn't even understand what I was seeing. Then it all hit me like a punch, and I realized as the phone continued to ring that Simon was holding Eric's phone, and it was my number saved like that on Eric's phone. I didn't know what to say, or if there was even anything I could say. I stayed quiet for a while, not sure if saying anything would just make him angrier. My silence was what made him furious, though. He glared at me as he explained that Eric had come up to him, apologized for the night he'd shown up unannounced, and then mumbled something about being late because of car trouble. Then he'd given his phone to Simon because he had to go to the bathroom and didn't want to leave it lying around. Then he said that he was planning to pass it on to one of my other coworkers, but then it started ringing, and when he saw the name, he didn't know how, but he knew. He'd hoped it wasn't me, but then I came over and outed myself with all my rambling. I tried to tell him that it was just a joke, a silly thing we did at the office, but he wasn't hearing it. Don't lie to me. His voice was low and deep when he said it. I've had my suspicions for weeks. The late nights, the texts, the way you look at him. It's all too much for me to ignore anymore. His voice only got louder and louder, and soon people started to look. I stepped closer to him and begged for us to take it outside, but he didn't budge. He just demanded that I tell him the truth about me and Eric. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. My eyes stung with tears, and I didn't know what to say that wouldn't make it worse. He kept screaming and asking for the truth, what I'd been doing with Eric, why my name was saved like that, how long it had been going on. It was question after question yelled at my face while all my colleagues, even my superiors, watched on. Before I could find the words, Simon looked past me, and what he saw made him even angrier. I knew before I turned around that it was Eric. He'd just come back from the bathroom, and he was looking so confused I would have felt bad for him if I didn't already feel bad for myself. He froze when he saw us and then took a few steps back when Simon marched toward him. I tried to stop him, but it was too late. Simon closed the distance, held Eric's phone up, and asked for everyone to hear if he had been sleeping with his wife. It felt like the entire room went silent and every conversation stopped. Eric didn't say anything, and neither could I. As you can imagine, this only made Simon more volatile. He grabbed Eric's shirt and yelled the question again. And that was when I knew I had no choice. If I didn't say something now, Simon would hit him. I could see it in his eyes. So I told the truth. I told him that some things had happened between us, but we'd never had sex. My voice was shaking through it all, and I was crying. He just stared at me, like he didn't believe he'd heard me right. It happened once, I added quickly, the lie falling out before I could stop it. We were drunk. It was stupid, but it didn't mean anything. For a second, Simon just stood there, then his face twisted in disbelief. Once? He repeated, his voice rising again. You're really standing here telling me it was only once? Then he let Eric go with a shove and turned to face me. He said that he knew right from the beginning that something was off, and I had made him feel crazy for it. I had called him paranoid when he'd known the truth all along, and I'd gone out of my way to hide it. People were staring outright now at the scene we made. No one was pretending not to listen. After that, he just spiraled. It was the worst I'd ever seen him. He went off on me and called me a liar and a whore, said that I humiliated him for months. But he didn't stop there. He went on, saying things I can't even remember word for word anymore. Just cruel, angry things that I think even he regretted the moment they left his mouth. And still, the room stayed silent. No one stepped in. No one looked away. Finally, when it seemed like he'd run out of things to say to me, he turned back to Eric, and before anyone could move or do anything, he did the one thing I'd been afraid of. He threw the phone on the ground and punched Eric in the face. People were shouting as Eric fell to the ground, but I could barely focus on that. I tried to reach for Simon, but he backed away like I was going to burn him. Then he told me not to come home and that he never wanted to see me again, before he stormed out. I stood there frozen and watched him leave. I could hear people rushing to help Eric behind me. Some were even yelling about calling an ambulance, but all I could focus on was how my marriage had just fallen apart. It's been a week since that night, and unsurprisingly, everything has fallen apart. The firm let me go 2 days after. They didn't say it outright, but I didn't need to be told why. My husband had literally attacked someone in the office, and I had fraternized with a coworker during a very important case. I'd have probably fired me too. I haven't been home since that night, and Simon hasn't called or texted. I've tried calling and texting him, but no response. I've been staying with a friend in the meantime. She tries not to ask too many questions, but I see the pity in her eyes. Eric hasn't spoken to me either, not since Simon broke his nose. I know he's been out of work, though, taking some time off after what happened, and every attempt I've made to reach him has gone unanswered. Not that I can blame him. Sometimes I think about going home, about trying to talk to Simon, but then I remember the look on his face when he said he never wanted to see me again. So I stay away. Every part of my life feels like it's crumbled. My marriage, my job, my reputation. It would all seem silly if it weren't my actual life. If I weren't living in this hell, I'd think it was funny how all this started because of a jacket and went to shit because of stupid title. And the worst part of all of it is knowing that, in a way, Simon was right all along.